Wars have been fought by kings and won by governments for centuries, but the real players in European history have never been in the headlines. Behind the palaces and the parliaments, there were families. Not royal families, but financial dynasties. Families that changed entire nations by controlling what kings could spend, who survived the financial collapse, and how continents were rebuilt from ruin. This is the Economic Archive. And today, we examine the hidden history of the banking families who shaped the Europe we know today, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes in controversy, but always with power that far exceeded their names. It all began in Renaissance Italy, where the Medici family built banks. But they created something much bigger, a financial empire that combined business, politics, art, and religion. Their banking empire had accounts from merchants to monarchs, and the popes themselves took Medici loans. By interest-bearing loans and double-entry bookkeeping, the Medici banking system brought banking sophistication to continental Europe. But their real power lay not in gold reserves, but in credit and the prestige that came with their patronage. When Pope Leo X came to power, he came as a Medici, and that proved that in Renaissance Europe, economic power could become spiritual and political power. As their banking empire grew, the Medici transformed Florence, then Italy, and finally, impressed systems that countries still employ to this day. While the Medici were visionaries, the Fuggers of Augsburg were the engineers of influence. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Jakob Fugger was the wealthiest man in Europe by financing empire, especially Charles V, who needed lots of money to finance his election as Holy Roman Emperor. Fugger's money influenced the leadership choices that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. In return, he was given monopolies, privileges, and access to copper and silver mines that expanded his influence from the Alps to the Vatican. The Fuggers believed that finance was not only about commerce, but also about leverage. Their letters of credit, commodities, and politics established a model for international banking, a model where loans were not only about business, they were leverage for influence. Nevertheless, even the Fuggers' influence would eventually give way to the emergence of a new power, the Rothschilds. By the 19th century, the Rothschild family had opened banking houses in 5 major European capitals, London and Paris, and Frankfurt, Naples, and Vienna. They transformed international finance by inventing cross-border bonds, sophisticated currency arbitrage, and private intelligence networks that obtained market-moving news before governments could act. The Rothschilds financed war efforts against Napoleon, built railroads that disseminated industrialization, and underwrote public debts that stabilized national currencies. But with great power came great secrecy, and with secrecy, suspicion. Few private families could influence markets and guide state policies on such a large scale. The label Rothschild-backed was at once a badge of honor for governments and a topic of conspiracy theories and secret networks. Sometimes blown out of proportion, but always grounded in truth. What made their business model the first of its kind was duplication. Each of the brothers ran a different branch, but all of them coordinated their efforts like separate central banks. In times of turmoil, their capital could prevent a bank run or shore up a flagging currency. Behind the scenes, they did not run countries, but their blessing was often necessary to rebuild one. And they were not alone. Other new families like the Warburgs in Germany, the Baron brothers in Britain, and the Hottingers. In France, stretching Europe's financial map beyond military or royal might, these families built institutions that would outlast their founders, and whose networks would outlast most regimes. When the First World War swept through Europe, many of these financial dynasties operated in the background. While massive armies marched towards war, gold moved secretly, financing troops, covering deficits, and drafting war reparations. In TSY, private bankers functioned as unofficial policymakers whose instruments of finance became weapons of state. The influence of families and private banks gradually gave way in the 20th century to bigger and more public institutions. Central banks took over control of a nation's money, and legislation ensured that no individual or family could wield overt influence. Nevertheless, many of today's biggest banks, from Credit Suisse to Deutsche Bank, from Barclays to HSBC, trace their lineage to family-run origins. But even as financial systems became more modernized, the private wealth networks that these systems spawned did not fade away. Family offices, offshore centers, and second-generation investments that maintained their reach over long periods of time. These networks of power and influence funded universities, rebuilt cities, and launched the kind of public finance that we take for granted today. But they remained curiously invisible in the history books, perhaps because their power was exercised not in politics or rhetoric, but in balance sheets and silence. To grasp how Europe evolved into a continent of empires, industries, and international institutions, we need to grasp who was behind the money flows. The Medici combined banking and politics. The Fuggers capitalized on the debt of empire building. The Rothschilds established a new era of capital mobility. Each of these banking dynasties has left a template, not merely of wealth, but of how power can persist even through times of revolution, world war, and monetary transformation. What they've shown over the centuries of their strategic play is that money becomes power when it is long-term, when it moves across borders unobtrusively, and when it is not merely spent, but lent. Their legacies lie concealed behind legal structures, in museum halls, in charitable trusts, and in political foundations. And although they are seldom mentioned today as public personalities, parts of their models exist within the frameworks that govern how modern civilizations spend, lend, and repay. At the Economic Archive, we recognize that financial dynasties are more than just historical tales. They are the blueprints for future systems, behind the quiet architecture of global order. If this documentary series has managed to shift your perspective on what power looks like in Europe's financial history, then subscribe to the Economic Archive. Like this video and share it with someone who still believes that wealth is loud. And let us know in the comments, were these families financial architects or private empire builders? Because when institutions forget their benefactors, we forget how the world was built quietly. The next video might just blow open the network that nobody saw coming.